Welcome to Keith and I Don't Tread on Anyone. This is a summary and analysis of Showtime's The Putin Interviews with Oliver Stone. The first topic they discuss is privatization. Vladimir Putin says, "I did not stop privatization, contrary to what Stone erroneously believed. I just wanted to make it more equitable, more fair." This is a principle that goes back to a University of Nevada, Las Vegas professor, Murray Rothbard, who says, well, imagine that the government, before disbanding itself, gives New York to the Rockefellers and Massachusetts to the Kennedys. Well, this would be unjust. So it's very important that governments try and equitably redistribute the stolen loot after disbanding themselves. The first very interesting thing that Putin goes into is when they speak about the war on terror and the U.S.-Russian alliance to stop terrorism. Vladimir Putin actually says Al-Qaeda is not the result of our activities, it is the result of the activities of our American friends. Now, if we go back to the movie Rambo, you'll actually see at the beginning that they mention the Mujahideen fighters of Afghanistan, widely recognized as allies to the Americans at the time. We actually have Hillary Clinton going on record on CNN saying, "Let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded them 20 years ago. Let's go recruit these Mujahideen, and great, let them come from Saudi Arabia and other countries importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so we can go beat the Soviet Union." And that's what the U.S. is doing today in Syria and Libya as well, funding the moderates. He goes on to discuss the Soviet-Afghan War from about 1979 to 1989. The American aspect of this was referred to as Operation Cyclone. Zbigniew Brzezinski said in a memo to Jimmy Carter that this is the chance to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. Vladimir Putin says, when the American intelligence officers provided support to different forms of Islamic fundamentalism, helping them to fight the Soviet troops in Afghanistan, so the Americans themselves nurtured both Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. Vladimir Putin goes on to say that the U.S. government funded terrorists in the Second Chechenian War. This is contrary to what bin Laden says. Bin Laden says, "You supported the Russian atrocities against us in Chechnya." Not really sure whose word to take on this. I would have to do more research, but it does get you into the inside of this is the result of constantly intervening, constantly creating enemies. Putin doesn't like us. Bin Laden doesn't like us. Well, what were the great benefits that the U.S. got? Were they morally justified in doing it and coercively funding the operation in the first place? Was this something they went publicly with to make sure that their Democratic constituents knew what their representatives were up to? Of course not. He then goes on to criticize Bush Jr. when he welcomed Albania and Croatia into NATO, despite the promise that they would not expand after German reunification. So here we have the U.S. breaking its promise again, and Vladimir Putin says this really interesting thing. He talks about how NATO, as well as the American government, appears to constantly be in search of a foe. Now that there's no Soviet Union, they're generally searching for someone to fight against. Putin says, "Therefore, why does NATO keep existing? My impression is that in order to justify its existence, NATO has a need of an external foe. There is a constant search for a foe, or some acts of provocation to name someone as an adversary." Again, Central Intelligence funding the Mujahideen, funding the moderates in Syria. Certainly, it's constantly about creating enemies. Putin goes on in a speech from the year 2000, talking about a post-Cold War world referred to as a unipolar world, in which there would be one central authority. He says, the unipolar world is unique insofar as there is namely one center of authority. It is a world in which there is one master, one sovereign, one center of force, one center of decision making. This is a world government, basically. He says that this is pernicious. not just for the world, but also for the sovereign itself, because it destroys itself from within, just as an overexpansive Soviet Union did. And pernicious in this case, tending to cause death or serious injury, deadly. He goes on in that speech, speaking in front of Joe Lieberman and John McCain, saying that one state, and of course, first and foremost, the United States has overstepped its national borders in every way. He then said back to the Oliver Stone interview, he says, nowadays, NATO is a mere instrument of U.S. foreign policy. This is another thing that creates enemies around the world. So, again, the existence of a government not only doesn't just automatically keep you safe because they have $1 trillion military, it can also keep you much less safe than you otherwise would be. It could stop you from having good relations and trade agreements and exchanges with other nations. Putin then goes on to say, and there is one curious thing. The presidents of your country change, but the policy doesn't change. They go on to discuss the 2016 military budgets. Putin says, Russia, we allocate $40 billion a year on defense needs, whereas the United States allocates more than $460 billion. Now, again, the justification is always, well, Russia's an adversary, one, and two, we need a very big military to keep us safe. Well, it's not like we're in an alliance with Russia, keeping them safe so they could have a lower defense budget like Scandinavian countries. The U.S. has NATO to oppose Russia and Russian expansion, even though NATO's the one expanding, of course. So, again, the existence of a big military does not necessarily keep you more safe. Putin goes on to say, it has become a fashion in the United States to speculate, to even abuse the Russian issue, so to speak. Afterwards, we're going to shake hands with you. You have to understand this is just election campaign rhetoric. This is in response to the 2016 Putin has meddled in our elections. So seeing it from a different point of view is very interesting. This is in no way to applaud Putin, but it's just interesting because if you want to go after the Gambino crime family, the people you got to look to is the Colombo crime family. They're their rivals who want to give you all the dirt on their opposition who they hate. So I think Putin's a terrible guy, obviously, a statist, advocator of initiating violence against peaceful people, but lots of really good insights to have. That is the end of part one. Part two begins with Putin saying, at first, President Clinton tried to persuade me to support the U.S. withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. No foundation, no basis at all. He was saying that there was a threat emanating from Iran going back to the 90s. More than 20 years later, they're still saying, watch out for Iran, we gotta kill their generals, etc. Even though with the exception of the Iran-Iraq war, Iran is not really involved in wars or interventions in other countries. Now, I want to define the term blowback. It is generally seen as negative repercussions affecting a country whose government has undertaken a usually clandestine intelligence operation in another country. You also have domestic blowback, which you could clearly see with Black Lives Matter riots all over America, but both a result of government intervention. Putin says that leaving this anti-ballistic missile treaty means nothing else than a new cycle of an arms race, of which the U.S. is expanding, getting Albania and Croatia back into NATO. Putin says, and our response is going to be much cheaper than an anti-ballistic missile system. So, again, he's saying that the U.S. Constantly building up its military, gets other militaries to build up themselves. This creates war. Again, the state is the health of war, and war is the health of the state. He goes on to discuss the intelligence that Russia gained from the United States. He says, suffice it to remember the Rosenberg spouses who were electrocuted. So, in other words, he's saying, yeah, there definitely is an intelligence connection into America. Now, this is often referred to as McCarthyism, which is to just say that there was one guy, McCarthy, who was really after it. The reality is that there were a number of people, and it turned out that he was right. We found this out through documents referred to as the Venona Papers or the Venona Cables. You have people like Alger Hiss and Harry Dexter White. You also have the Rosenbergs. You also have scientists like K.E.J. Fuchs. You have Laughlin Curry. You had a lot of Soviet agents that were exposed as a result of these cables. There were about 350 Soviet spies in the U.S. State Department at the time. So, as far as the Rosenbergs go, he says, well, where did the Rosenbergs get that information from to give the atomic bomb information to the Soviets? Putin says, they provided this information to the Soviet Union of their own volition to restore the nuclear balance in the world. Whereas governments often seek to be the monopoly on violence, sometimes citizens are able to redistribute the amount of power to stop such a monopoly from happening. Of course, they say the private sector, the voluntary sector, and free markets are where monopolies arise. Governments are the biggest monopoly and constantly cause monopolies to exist where we otherwise would have more competition and more equality among groups. Again, we have this idea of blowback. Vladimir Putin says, let me remind you the reason why the Cuban Missile Crisis started. It was by placing they only placed Soviet missiles in Cuba because they were provoked by the stationing of American missiles in Turkey. Again, U.S. expansion leads to a response. So it's always critical that the propagandists say, out of nowhere, the U.S. was attacked for no reason because we were just sitting here doing nothing by the Japanese. Same thing for 9/11, and then out of nowhere, the Soviet Union starts expanding. Now Russia's expanding out of nowhere. It's important that they only tell you one side of what's going on. So you see that there's a clear aggressor and a clear victim, so you could justify any amount of civilian casualties and any amount of trillions of dollars going to Boeing and Raytheon. They then get into domestic policy in Russia. And he asked him about treatment of homosexuals in Russia. Vladimir Putin says, there is a law that prohibits propaganda of homosexualism among minors. And once they become an adult at 18, there are no restrictions whatsoever. But in Russia, we still don't have a situation like they have in certain Islamic states where there is the death penalty threatening homosexuals. This is something the LGBT community absolutely needs to address more, certainly if they actually care about the principles behind what they advocate. Vladimir Putin goes on to say, I believe it's my duty to uphold traditional values and family values. He goes on to discuss the U.S. Ukrainian intervention on behalf of Ukraine against Russia. He says these riots in Ukraine were actively supported by the United States. This is in alliance with an article from National Public Radio in America. U.S. steps in response to Russia's intervention in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin says, after that, the United States has unilaterally withdrawn from the anti-ballistic missile treaty from 2001. Allegedly, they did that to counter the threat to Iran. They do sort of go in circles here, but I am trying to go chronologically. They then discuss Georgia in 2008, a country south of Russia. He says, we were surprised when we saw that President Saakashvili's aggression was not only supported by Bush, but that Russia was being painted as the aggressor. So again, U.S. is intervening, picking sides, and creating more enemies, making us less safe than we otherwise would be. Then, they're in the car. By the way, the most interesting thing about this is the fact that Vladimir Putin is driving his own car. They're talking about Edward Snowden. So, Oliver Stone asks Putin about Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden now is living in Russia, allegedly. Vladimir Putin says, on the whole, the relationship dampened because the United States supported terrorist groups in the Caucasus. That's why they couldn't just extradite Snowden and have, an open relationship. So that could be a benefit of, countries not working together, is having some sort of balance of power. Putin goes on to say, but then I got a report that Snowden was on a plane bound for Moscow to transfer to another plane and fly to Latin America, if I'm not mistaken. Oliver Stone says, well, what do you think about Snowden as a man? And Putin, former KGB agent, says, he is a courageous man, more probably even foolhardy. Vladimir Putin goes on to say, of course America asked us to extradite him, Edward Snowden, and it's quite understandable why we couldn't do that. Back then, we proposed that we should conclude a treaty on cooperation on legal matters. So this would be a good case of countries being separate. It certainly is not just a one-way street. Vladimir Putin goes on to say, that was our initiative, and it would have stipulated for mutual extradition of criminals, but the U.S. refused to cooperate with us in that field. Given the fact that the U.S. has never extradited any criminals to us who have sought asylum there, it was inadmissible to us to unilaterally extradite Snowden as it was asked of by the United States. One example of this would be article from the BBC. Moscow slams Chech's U.S. asylum. Russian officials have condemned a decision by the U.S. to grant asylum to a high-ranking Chechnyan separatist who Moscow says is a terrorist. So this was the precedent that Putin was acting on. He was asked why he resigned from the KGB. He says, I resigned because I didn't agree with the actions undertaken by the government. Talking about spying and intelligence agencies, Putin says, and secondly, trying to spy on your allies if you really consider them allies and not vassals. Vassals being a person who held land from a feudal lord and received protection in return for homage and allegiance. A bondman, a slave, a subordinate or dependent, saying that it's important to recognize the difference in geopolitics with regards to allies and vassals. So when you see something like Israel constantly spying on Americans and the Americans spying on other countries, it's unrealistic to consider these allied situations and much more of attempts for one country to gain power over another. Oliver Stone then says, please have Mr. Putin tell me about his adaptation of Orthodox religion back into the Russian system. Putin says, this renaissance is due to the fact that the communist ideology ceased to exist. I was not the one to do this. The Russian people did that themselves. The communist ideology ceasing to exist, that left an ideological vacuum, and this vacuum could only be filled with religion. This is a great insight that very seldom is it the result of rationality and principles that people change, but it's just offering them an alternative, and it's the old Sun Tzu case of build your opponent a golden bridge to which he can retreat. Vladimir Putin says, for example, take Europe and the United States of today, and you'll see that the people with other religions are mostly immigrants. Russia is different. Those people with other religions are Russians, and it is their homeland, and they have none other. And over 1,000 years, we've nurtured a certain culture of interaction. So, again, you'll see two totally different approaches that Putin has to the purpose of government versus maybe U.S. officials, where they certainly are not valuing cultures of interaction. They're constantly trying to regulate and stifle innovation and interactions that otherwise could exist and be very fruitful. Putin says, unlike many partners of ours, constantly referring to the U.S. as our partners, we never interfere with the domestic affairs of other countries. Now, I don't know if that's true. I think that's extremely unlikely that they went from a Soviet Union KGB constantly collecting intelligence on everyone, and now they don't do it. I can't imagine there's a country that goes without it, but this is his response. Oliver Stone says, "So why are you so hated in the United States?" Putin says, "The ruling class believe that they have to fight Russia, that they have to restrain Russia to contain our development." This again is much like the British case against the Germans. Once they saw Germany becoming a rival power, they constantly tried to villainize Kaiser Wilhelm. This takes us into part 3. This is very interesting. Putin says everything can be perverted and distorted. Millions of people can be deceived if you use the monopoly on the media. Really valuable quote. Everything can be perverted and distorted. Millions of people can be deceived if you use the monopoly on media. This is in stark contrast to the idea that, well, you can't really get away with things in reality. If, one or two people know, maybe, but if like 3 people know, then the story leaks and everyone always finds out. But Putin, KGB officer, head of Russia for about 4 elections now, certainly has a different idea than the average Joe that you speak with. In America, they had Operation Mockingbird, a fully implemented Central Intelligence Agency program. This was released in the Church Committee hearings. This was to spread disinformation throughout the American media. CIA Director William Colby testified to the Church Committee that over 400 CIA agents were active in the U.S. media to control what was reported through American mainstream television, newspapers, and magazines. Putin goes on to discuss U.S.-Ukrainian interference. We have John McCain, the Great War hero again, going to Ukraine to tell them, this is about the future you deserve. We have Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasian Affairs, giving $5 billion in funds to Ukraine in opposition to what Russia was doing in Ukraine. But hey, realize how dangerous this could be. A border dispute from arbitrary lines written after the First World War between the Reich and the Polish led to a Second World War. So constantly interfering is really playing Russian roulette with hundreds of millions of peaceful civilians who just want to live lives and be with their families, choose careers, etc. He goes on to pin this constant interference in the Ukrainian Revolution, so-called, on places like the National Endowment for Democracy, blatant CIA operation there. He mentions that people like George Soros and Carl Gershom, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, George Soros being an investor and founder of the Open Society Foundations, these people were constantly going over to Ukraine, offering aid and just emotional support. That's really big. It's about changing public opinion, as Putin said. If you control the media, you control the general ideology in the populace. You have Joe Biden delivering a speech to the Ukrainian people on their second chance for freedom, December 8th, 2019. That's his address to the Rada, the Ukrainian legislature. Putin goes on to say, I do not always understand the rationality behind the actions of our partners, United States government. I get the impression that they have to enforce control over the Euro-Atlantic camp, and to that end, they need an external enemy. Again, we see this in foreign affairs. Watch out for Russia, watch out for North Korea, watch out for Iran, watch out for Iraq, watch out for Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, which are the same group that hate us for our freedom. They're constantly trying to create foreign enemies. And domestically, they do the same thing. Watch out for the rich. Watch out for the immigrants. Watch out for the whites. Watch out for the men. Watch out for the racists. The real enemy is people who have this belief in authority and the right to initiate violence against peaceful people. So this is Oliver Stone in the Black text saying, did you make a mistake by annexing Crimea? Annex, assuming to take by force and claim rulership of. Putin disagrees with his premise, saying the citizens of Crimea decided to join Russia. He says, we were there to regulate the elections, but we did not engage in any hostilities. Military members there just to make sure the election goes according to plan. According to the official story, Crimea referendum, 93% of them voted to join Russia. 7% said they wanted to stay with Ukraine. 50% of all votes counted. This according to Russia Today. Heaven knows what those results are, but same goes with pretty much any election that's counted by a government. Back to Ukrainian, U.S.-Ukrainian collusion. Through initiating the crisis in Ukraine, the Americans, managed to stimulate such an attitude towards Russia, viewing Russia as an enemy, a possible potential aggressor. They go on to discuss the similarities between the National Security Agency and Russia's new Big Brother anti-terrorism law. The article here from The Guardian says, lower house votes in favor of package of amendments that campaigners say will violate privacy and freedom. So he goes from saying, yeah, Snowden's a good guy to, we shouldn't be spying. Any country who spies is really a country that seeks to have vassals and not allies. And now he's totally going back on his word, saying that, well, it's okay because we're doing it against the terrorists. And when Stone confronts Putin about this, Putin just goes back to Snowden, totally changing the subject. He goes, well, Snowden revealed that there was surveillance performed by the NSA and the CIA of citizens across the world, of political leaders and their allies. Again, yes, he's very good at explaining why his rivals are evil, but he's more often than not just looking into a mirror, able to recognize his own flaws in others. Stone says, in the matter of Syria, can you describe what is generally going on in the Syrian, Libyan, Middle East debacle? Putin says, but in Libya and Iraq, a tragedy has transpired. And that has happened due to the forceful ousting of current regimes. And we don't want the same thing to happen in Syria. He's saying that government intervention leads to destabilization and a worse situation than you otherwise would have had there not been such foreign intervention. Even if foreigners interfere and take down a tyrannical leader like Saddam, it's not obvious that a peaceful, all-loving regime will come and take its place. Very often you have the forces of Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram can certainly gain power in places when these dictators are taken down. So again, opposing regime change of Gaddafi, Assad, Saddam does not make you pro those people. It just means you don't believe in violently intervening. I'm not pro-Trump, but I don't support Brazil coming in and overthrowing Trump and installing Brazilian democracy and their ideas. So it's important to have a consistent philosophy and recognizing the trade-offs that exist when a group of liars funded to the tune of trillions is invading countries like this. We have documents going back to 1983 where we have the Central Intelligence Agency, according to their own website, CIA.gov, about documents that they want to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria along with the Ba'ath Party. A document titled Bringing Real Muscle to Bear Against Syria. This is a little background into how U.S. has sort of operated in the Middle East alongside Israel and Great Britain. The document reads, Syria summary. Syria at present has a hammerlock on U.S. interests both in Lebanon and in the Gulf. Through closure of Iraq's pipeline, thereby threatening Iraqi internationalization of the war. The U.S. should consider sharply escalating the pressures against Assad, this is the Assad regime back in 1983, from three border states hostile to Syria, Iraq, Israel, and Turkey. Iraq, perceived to be increasingly desperate in the Gulf War, would undertake limited military air operations against Syria with the sole goal of opening a pipeline. Syria would also face a two-front war. So they were talking about starting a war in Syria to justify this imperialist adventure for a pipeline back in the 1980s. Another document in July of 1986 called Syria, Scenarios for Dramatic Political Change. This memorandum presents a number of possible scenarios that could lead to the ouster of President Assad or other dramatic changes in Syria. Point number 2, we will send you similar papers on other countries as they are contemplated. So again, these countries, these operations are constantly discussed in the back rooms of the Pentagon, Langley, and then sold to the populace later. It's never, they wait for an incident and then respond. It's always they make a decision and then decide what incident justifies their entrance. The fake chemical weapons attack, for example, which was exposed by Aaron Mate in an excellent article in The Nation. I believe it's titled, Did Trump Bomb Syria on False Pretenses? So now, today, this document's from 1986. Today, we have the CIA openly involved in Syrian affairs. Washington Post, CIA begins weapons delivery to Syrian rebels. CIA ramping up covert training program for moderate Syrian rebels. This is according to the LA Times. In Syria, militias armed by the Pentagon fight those armed by the CIA. Sounds very much like Putin saying they need to create an external foe. They're constantly creating enemies. We also have a 4-star retired U.S. Army general of the Supreme Allied Command, Wesley Clark, in A Democracy with Amy Goodman, who says, I was privy to a document that said we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. Again, these are planned in advance and later sold to the public. It's not like the military's there to defend you once something happens. They plan these things far in advance before the public finds out about it. The propaganda around Syria has just been so incredibly in your face. CNN had a 7-year-old from Syria who spoke who spoke English very well. And the 7-year-old, Bana Alabed, came to the conclusion that the U.S. definitely needs to intervene against the Assad regime. This interview is, well, when you first watch it, it's comical and pathetic. And then you watch it a second time, and it's more sad than anything else. Another example of blatant propaganda around Syria was ABC World News, where they said, look, we have footage of Assad killing the Kurds in the Syria, Iraq area. They didn't say exactly where it was, but they said, look at this. And on the left-hand side, you can see slaughter in Syria on ABC World News tonight. This is primary sources. So, they show all this fire and fury and all these explosions going off, and you think, my God, I can't imagine the indiscriminate bombing and all the civilians. Well, it turns out this was totally fake news. They apologized, saying, we've taken down the video that aired on World News Tonight Sunday and Good Morning America, 2 of the biggest shows in the United States for, quote, news, this morning that appeared to be from a Syrian border immediately after questions were raised about its accuracy. It was actually a gun range in Kentucky, as you can see on the right-hand side. People are filming a gun show, rather. So again, look at how the media just plays Russian roulette with the masses. They have started wars based off things that didn't happen at all, like the Gulf of Tonkin. So when you get things like the Syrian gas attack, totally fake. This one also totally fake. Think of how close this came to resulting in U.S. escalation. U.S. against Syria, where Russia comes in on behalf of Syria for Assad, and Iran takes the side of Syria. I mean, that could have been a third world war. Thankfully, someone said, those explosions look kind of familiar. Honey, do you have the video from the Kentucky gun range? I mean, what are the chances that would come out? And this is what we catch them on. The media is so blatantly dishonest. We also have Obama tells United Nations Syria's Assad must go for gassing his own people. Oh, wait, that was Bill Clinton using CS gas against the Branch Davidians. I guess it's different when Assad does it. But yeah, you have Obama, who's going to come in and get out of the Middle East, stop these regime change wars. No, of course, he lied and then escalated them. Back to Putin. He says, Moreover, if the same thing, regime change, as in Libya happens in Syria, the position of radical organizations, terrorist organizations, are going to be strongly solidified. So, when Assad falls, it's not, Thomas Jefferson or Murray Rothbard that takes its place. It's ISIS and al-Nusra. This is according to the LA Times. U.S.-backed rebels launched their first attack against the Islamic State, and they launched the United States trained the rebel new Syrian army in hopes that it would be a formidable opponent to Islamic State jihadists. But in its first serious test, an offensive near the Syrian border town of Bukhao, the rebels appear to have failed. Islamic State took much of the oil-rich desert region straddling the border between Iraq and Syria in 2014, constantly intervening, constantly creating the conflicts in Syria, going back to the 80s, does not yield a better outcome. Oliver Stone asks, how big is ISIS? Is this something we really need to worry about? Considering we didn't really hear about ISIS. It was always Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's the bad guy, and the Taliban. And then all of a sudden, Al-Qaeda just stopped being the bad guy, and now it's ISIS, ISIL, Daesh. Putin says the approximate number of terrorists participating in ISIS is about 80,000 people. 30,000 of them are foreign mercenaries from 80 countries around the world. So, one, you can look at the innocent explanation and say, gosh, people are really motivated to come fight on behalf of this radical organization. Well, what would motivate them in the first place? Or you could recognize, well, they're certainly getting some funding from somewhere. And when you have, constant intervention by Central Intelligence and the Pentagon, you have to question who is, where is the funding coming from? Again, CIA and Pentagon, according to LA Times, using funds to fight against one another. They go on to back to U.S.-Russian relations, and there was an incident referred to as the Donald Cook provocation in the Black Sea, where 12 times in 90 minutes, a Russian jet buzzes by a U.S. warship, where the U.S. said this was provocative and unprofessional. Now, it's important to know that this happened in the Black Sea, where if you look at where the Black Sea is, it's right, it borders Russia, and it borders Ukraine. What is the U.S. warship doing there in the first place? Of course, it wouldn't justify bombing, but certainly if it was a Russian jet on the Pacific coast of Long Island, New York, and the U.S. would say, well, that boat is the one being provocative. They're obviously there, so at any moment they could fake an incident, just like the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Putin goes on the end of part 3 to say, the Prime Minister of Ariel Sharon told me once while I was paying a visit to Israel, Mr. President, right now you are in a region where no one can ever be trusted in any manner. One of the greatest cases of projection I think I've ever come across. We then go into part 4. Oliver Stone starts by saying, this is your 4th U.S. president. What changes? He actually asks him, what changes? Now, for those of you who are not in America, we have generally 2 parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. You have Bill Clinton on the starting with Bill Clinton in the upper left, a Democrat, then George Bush, a Republican, then Barack Obama, first African-American president, Democrat, and then Republican Donald Trump. So let's hear the in-depth analysis between 4 separate presidents with separate backgrounds coming in at totally different times, belonging to 2 different parties. What changes? Oliver Stone asked. Putin says, well, almost nothing. But on the whole, everywhere, especially in the United States, the bureaucracy, deep state, is very strong, and bureaucracy is the one thing that rules the world. Then we get into claims from the 2016 election. Oliver Stone openly asked Putin, why did you hack us? What was that about? Very unkind of you. We then run across a CNN headline, Clinton blames hacks on Putin grudge, where she's actually on audio saying, we know that Putin did this. She mentioned this in the presidential debates against Donald Trump. She said, we have 17 intelligence agencies. Sam Harris also said this very proudly to Scott Adams. And after loudly saying 17 intelligence agencies, not one, not two, but 17 independently decided that Russia was behind these. Obviously, Russia is behind this. The New York Times was the source of that, and then eventually the New York Times actually came out with a correction, June 29th, 2017. A White House memo article on Monday about President Trump's deflections and denials about Russia referred incorrectly to the source of an intelligence assessment that said Russia orchestrated hacking attacks during last year's presidential election. The assessment was made by 4 intelligence agencies: the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the National Security Agency. CIA, Operation Mockingbird, Church Committee, MKUltra, FBI, COINTELPRO, PATCON, NSA, lying about spying on millions of Americans. James Clapper lied under oath. These are not people you can trust at all. So it went from 17 to 4, 3 of which are so blatantly dishonest. They just have no credibility. According to the mafia, their rival is doing a bad thing. Well, that's not a valid source. It's completely biased and not independent of having an interest in the outcome. The assessment was not approved by all 17 organizations in the American intelligence community. Now, notice, when Hillary Clinton said this in the presidential debates, you didn't have the other 16 agencies or the 4 agencies come out and say, excuse me, we just need to make a correction here. Well, they're not about intelligence or informing the public. They're used to coercively implement the ideas of a small elite on the rest of us and mold public opinion to the desires of the ruling class or those who seek to violently dominate over others. We also have a WikiLeaks memo that says, best approach is to slaughter Donald for his bromance with Putin. Notice it says best approach is to slaughter. It doesn't say mention facts A, B, and C that we know in order to expose to the public who we'd like to inform. It just says slaughter him with his bromance for Putin. But not too far betting on Putin re-Syria. Brent. This is one of the John Podesta emails. Now, as far as foreign interference in an election, if you go to clintonfoundation.org/contributors, you can look at donations amounts between $10 million and $25 million to the Clinton donation. In there, we have the Commonwealth of Australia, we have the Kingdom of Norway, the government of Norway, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia currently committing genocide in Yemen. So the idea that, oh my God, a foreign government interfered, that's just openly done. We have AIPAC in America, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, which is just blatant Israeli interference. This is not anything new. We also have 2006 leaked audio tape from Hillary Clinton that proposes rigging the Palestinian election. Hillary Clinton, I do not think we should have pushed for an election in the Palestinian territories. I think that was a big mistake. Doesn't sound very pro-democracy, pro-let's represent the people. She goes on to say, and if we were going to push for an election, then we should have made sure we did something to determine who was going to win. Well, of course, this is U.S. interference, another case of blatant projection on behalf of Hillary Clinton. Putin says we did not hack the election out at all, outright denying it. Julian Assange also said our source is not the Russian government, on multiple occasions saying that Russia was not their source. Who knows if it's true? Even if it was true, it matters more about whether the information they got was true. It is that to steal an analogy from Stefan Molyneux, he says, it's like if your girlfriend says, I have proof you cheated on me that Marissa gave to you. And you say, that Marissa gave to me. And you say, Marissa is interfering in our relationship. Well, is it true? Are you cheating on me? That information is from someone else, and they're interfering. It's like, okay, well, then you're obviously guilty of something if that's your only criticism, and you're not actually attacking the documentation. Goes on to say there was not only no interference from Russia into America, but America and the European Union are constantly intervening in Russia. We have Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian affairs. We work with inside sources that want to work with us, referring to the LGBT community in Russia and other organizations that are, quote, pro-democratic. Putin says they rallied the opposition forces, much like they do with BLM and Antifa in America. They funded rallies and the opposition. The Tides Foundation, the Open Society Foundation, they are constantly doing this both domestically and internationally. Joe Biden and Barack Obama respond to the Russian hacking allegations. Joe Biden says in February of 2016, we're sending a message. We're retaliating against them for, quote, hacking. Still sitting on that evidence, though. Barack Obama, Julian Assange saying that it wasn't their source. Barack Obama in December of 2016, when any foreign government tries to impact the integrity of our elections, we need to take action. So Barack Obama is very opposed, along with Joe Biden, when one government interferes in the affairs of another. Well, we have Barack Obama on record saying Gaddafi needs to go. You have total support for U.S. in Libya. We have Obama urges Britain to stay in the European Union. That appears to be interference. Barack Obama endorses Emmanuel Macron in opposition to Marine Le Pen. This counts certainly as interference. Obama tells UN Syria's Assad must go. And of course, we have the famous tape of Hillary Clinton laughing, "We came, we saw, he died," referring to the U.S. involvement in Libyan affairs that ended with Gaddafi getting killed. The totally blatant double standard that it's just impossible that this doesn't get exposed more. Los Angeles Times, the U.S. is no stranger to interfering in the elections of other countries. The U.S. has a long history of attempting to influence presidential elections in other countries. It's done as many as 81 times between 1946 and 2000, according to a database amassed by political scientist Don Levin of Carnegie Mellon University. That number doesn't include military coups and regime change efforts following the election of candidates the U.S. didn't like, notably those in Iran. This was the 1953 Operation Ajax, Guatemala, 1954, intervention with the Central Intelligence Agency, where they first put the CIA's Study in Assassination manual into effect, and Chile, which was in 1973 against Allende, installing Augusto Pinochet. Nor does it include general assistance with the electoral process, such as election monitoring. Election interference by the U.S. 1946 to 2000. America is no stranger. Yeah, that is the Carnegie Mellon University study. Putin goes on to discuss the weapons used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It opened a tragic page in the history of humanity because they released a terrible genie from the bottle. There was no military sense behind using nuclear atomic weapons. See, at the time, the U.S. and the Soviets were allies. Even though, of course, the Soviet Union did exactly what Nazi Germany did as far as the Holocaust goes. They had the Holodomor in Ukraine, and then they literally invaded Poland 2 weeks apart from one another. So, again, it's gangs picking other gangs to rival other gangs. We need to have principal differences in who we support and who we oppose. He was then asked directly about Stalin and Lenin. Vladimir Putin says, "You can try to demonize him, Stalin, however much you like. We try to talk about his merits in achieving victory over fascism." He then mentions, well, what about Oliver Cromwell, who was an English general and statesman who led the Parliament of England's armies against King Charles I during the English Civil War and ruled the brutal Isles as Lord Protector from 1653 until his death in 1658. You could easily say that the Bolsheviks had a civil war against the Tsars. He said, Oliver Cromwell was a bloodthirsty man who arrived in power on the wave of a revolution, and he turned into a dictator and a tyrant. Yet, there are monuments to him scattered across Great Britain. He says Napoleon is deified, so don't hate on us for liking Stalin and Lenin. He says, well, of course, we all have these birthmarks as countries. However, this does not mean that we should forget all the atrocities committed under Stalinism, the destruction of millions of our compatriots, the extermination camps, etc. He's then asked, what is oligarchy? It is the integration of money and power, says Putin, with a view to influence the decisions that are being taken and the final aim of being the accumulation of wealth. Putin then goes on to say, we have to address the economic gap between the rich and those people with a low-level income. Back in 2000, we had around 40 million people living in poverty. Russia, right now, the figure is still high, but it has decreased by half. So they've cut the amount of poverty from 40 million to 20 million. Now that they've had more time apart from the Soviet Union, and now he's more focused on inequality. Now, the reason tyrants love inequality is, one, because it's completely unachievable. Human beings are so diverse that it's going to be impossible for them to have equal outcomes in life. So because it's so unachievable, it's also undefinable. What does it mean? Equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, equality of happiness, equality of property, equality of attention in the media. It's so undefinable that they can always say, look, there's inequality over here. Government needs to have more power. So this is a common trait amongst tyrants of all backgrounds. He's then asked about happiness by Oliver Stone. Putin says, you are far wealthier. He's asked about wealth and happiness in regards to oligarchy or just in the nature of humanity itself. Putin says, you are far wealthier than those who have greater wealth in their accounts. You have an opinion of your own. You have a talent. You have a chance to show this talent, and you have a chance to leave a great legacy behind. The documentary ends with Putin saying money doesn't bring this kind of happiness, because when you are in a coffin, you don't have any pockets to take your money to the grave with you. Thank you for watching this summary and analysis of the Putin interviews with Vladimir Putin and Oliver Stone. Thank you for watching Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone.